Welcome to our virtual book launch. Lillie P. Bliss, collector, advocate, and visionary benefactor of the Museum of Modern Art with Dr. Irene M. Walsh. Dr. Irene M. Walsh is a London-based independent art historian and writer focused on European and American modern art, museums, and the art markets. She was a recipient of a Frick Research Library grant where she researched today's topic, which was used in her dissertation and publication. So without further ado, I'm going to switch this over to Irene.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I would like to get right up front my sincerest thanks to the Frick Collection and the Frick Art Research Library and the Center for the History of Collecting, and of course, Stephen Burry. As I hope we discuss later, the unique resources I was able to access during my fellowship in 2019 made my PhD on this book possible. To the extent that this scholarship, together with the recent efforts of the Museum of Modern Art, served to bring the Bliss story into the light where it can be appreciated and learned from, the effort will have been worthwhile. What is this story about, and where are we going to go over the next hour? Well, we're going to explore three topics. The first is people, our primary subject, Bliss, the key events that shaped her life and her network, many members of which are bold-faced names in modern history. We're going to look at institutions, MoMA and its counterparts, and how they evolved over the second quarter of the 20th century, an evolution in which Bliss's collection played a starring role. And we're going to look at works of art. In this narrative, the masterpieces created by Paul Cézanne, Georges Seurat, Paul Gauguin, not to mention Arthur B. Davies, are treated as characters in their own right, whose perceived cultural capital rises and falls over time as they are traded in the art market, institutionalized in museums, and travel the sometimes bumpy road to canonization. Let me introduce some facts that will give context to our discussion. Here are the key actors and formative events in our story. Lillie Plummer Bliss herself is shown here in a passport photo from the 1920s. She was born in Boston in 1864 into a mercantile family, dry goods and textiles, that relocated to New York City just after the Civil War and gained a solid foothold in society and civic culture. Her father, Cornelius, was a successful politician who would have become president had he accepted William McKinley's offer of the vice presidency instead of Theodore Roosevelt. The family lived in the heart of Murray Hill, then the city's most exclusive neighborhood, catty-corner to the Morgans with whom they were friends. Lillie led the life of an unmarried woman of her class, with some variations. She was an accomplished pianist. She had a wide circle of associates in the performing arts. She periodically accompanied her father to Washington, and she was entirely devoted to the care of her invalid mother, who lived until 1923. In 1908, her 44th year, legend has it that she wandered into the Aladdin's cave of the antiquities dealer Dickon Kalekian, who would provide an entree into the world of art that she would inhabit for the rest of her life. Kalekian was also a major collector of modern art and introduced Bliss to William Macbeth, the dealer who was almost single-handedly responsible for creating a brand for American art. Through Macbeth, she met and began to patronize Arthur B. Davis, then America's most prominent living artist. While his art has faded in importance today, he will forever be recognized as the impresario behind the International Exhibition of Modern Art, the Armory Show of 1913. The show is often credited as the turning point in American public recognition and acceptance of the new art movements proliferating throughout the world at that moment. It is also the event that foregrounds a debate about the relative merits of American versus European cultural product, what I call in the book the nationalist debate, that hovers over the art market and museum collecting policies for many subsequent decades. For Bliss, it is the seminal event in her career. Her role is threefold: lender, purchaser, and funder. My research suggests that she was responsible, anonymously through Davies, for about 40% of the show's funding. And equally important, the show positions her right at the center of a coterie of collectors, dealers, and critics, such as John Quinn, Newman Montrose, and Walter Pock, who would play pivotal roles in modern art advocacy in subsequent years. Next slide, please. Shown here is a compendium of the dealers that Bliss patronized, starting with Macbeth and ending with Valentine 20 years later. This is also a snapshot of the post-Armory Show marketplace that expanded, diversified, and prospered in spite of, or because of, a variety of factors, including World War I, the abolishment of the exclusionary tariff on European contemporary art, and the 1920s economic boom that ended with the crash of 1929, the year of MoMA's founding. Besides being larger, the domestic art market became more collector-friendly in the sense that many dealers no longer define themselves as purveyors of either American or European art, but rather offered a blend of the best available from whichever continent it emerged. Each of the dealers shown here are representative of one or another of the defining trends of this market era. For example, Keppel and Knoedler move with the times, evolving from purveyors of Penel prints to becoming the primary market makers for Gauguin by the mid-1920s. Crush Hour is an anchor of a three-legged transatlantic dealer network. De Hock, Birnbaum, and the duo of Pierre Matisse and Valentine Dudesing represent a new generation, more thinly capitalized and yet more responsive to emerging artists. It is hard to choose one pivotal figure among these dealers, but I would have to single out Marius de Zayas, shown here, the dramatic mustache on the left. He's a Mexican artist, associate of Stieglitz, and promoter of African art alongside European modernism. For Bliss, he was an influencer, reinforcing her understanding of the lineage of modern art and helping expose her collection in a number of groundbreaking exhibitions. And he was also a supplier of the group of Cezanne masterpieces for which the Bliss collection is best known. Next slide, please. And here is a taste of the collection, which totaled more than 300 paintings and works on paper, dating from a Daumier of 1832 through a Davies of 1925. Many of the pictures shown here have an enduring public profile. Cézanne's Bather of 1855, Matisse's Interior with a Violin Case of 1918-19, Picasso's Woman in White, 1923. But others are works by Davies, Unicorns, 1906, and Dweller on the Threshold, 1915, and Charles and Maurice Prendergast, Spirit of the Hunt, 1917. While these works were not always appreciated, Alfred Bard dismissed Bliss's American holdings by claiming, quote, she felt the superiority of the French, unquote. They actually demonstrate the collection's depth and personality. And so the story of Bliss's collecting is a taste for the decorative, a rejection of nationalist silos, trading with a multiplicity of dealers, and grand-scale patronage of American artists. Bottom line on the collection, not the most daring, not the most valuable. Its importance is the fact that it existed long enough to be exposed and then institutionalized, which was regrettably not the case for many other of the great collections of this period, most notably that of John Quinn. And now we'll move on to what many feel is the most interesting part of the story, the foundation and first quarter century of the Museum of Modern Art. My book does not attempt to rewrite that history, but rather to put Bliss and the Bliss collection at the forefront of it. Slide, please. First, the cast of characters. While the myth of the founding mothers, Bliss, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, and Mary Quinn Sullivan, still has currency, this slide highlights the wider group of key actors. The genesis is the organizing committee shown at left, which importantly included Conyer Goodyear and Professor Paul Sachs from Harvard. That group recruited Alfred H. Bard Jr. and J.R. Abbott, and within months was widened with additional trustees, such as the noted collectors Stephen Carlton Clark and Duncan Phillips. The point to make here is that all of these individuals had cultural and commercial power in New York, and were intimately acquainted with art, the art markets, and the other museums. Eventually, there would be a kind of interlocking directorate on the boards of the Metropolitan Museum and MoMA. While Barr was, of course, instrumental, he was far from the dominant voice in this extraordinary group. And Bliss was at the very center, serving as vice president and making seminal contributions in all areas from policy to fundraising to exhibition design. Next slide. This slide gives a flavor of MoMA's first year and Bliss's penultimate one. Bliss was simultaneously engaged in planning the museum's first rented physical space, shown here in a photo of the Heckscher building at a contractor's invoice for fixtures and fittings, and executing on her own project, the Penthouse, at 1001 Park Avenue, where she would show her collection in its entirety for the first time in this purpose-built music room gallery. And of course, planning and executing on MoMA's inaugural exhibition, Cezanne, Gauguin, Seurat, Van Gogh, which was bolstered by Bliss Collection loans. The fledgling institution's leadership was also engaged in intense philosophical debates about the museum's identity and mission. Three questions loomed large. Would MoMA be a showcase for domestic or foreign modernism? How would a modern museum stay modern? And how would it integrate into the museum ecosystem in which the Metropolitan was preeminent? In other words, should it be the American Luxembourg, a shorthand at the time for the feeder model of the Musée Luxembourg's relationship to the Louvre? These questions would be unresolved for the next quarter century and hovered over the institution even as it evolved into the world's authoritative voice on modern art. Next slide. Just after her last major project, the Davies Memorial Exhibition at the Metropolitan, Bliss was diagnosed with cancer in mid-1930. She remained active with MoMA Matters and other commitments, including hosting Henri Matisse at her apartment in the fall. After a brief period of decline, she died on March 12, 1931, at the age of 67. Abby Rockefeller wrote, "You can imagine what a great shock it was for me to learn of Miss Bliss's death and how deeply grieved I am. I had the greatest admiration and respect, as well as deep affection for her, and I feel that her loss to the museum is almost irreparable." Bliss's life and work were celebrated by friends and colleagues at a memorial in her magnificent music room gallery, and her collection was publicly exposed in a traveling exhibition that was widely applauded in the popular and art press nationwide. Her generous and visionary plan to endow MoMA was a virtual secret known only to her executors and Conyers Goodyear, who said at the memorial, "May we who had the high privilege of her friendship, who cared for it and kept it, find the means to keep her gift here where she wished it to be." Next slide. Bliss's last will and testament made MoMA her primary beneficiary. But there was much more to the story, and the fact that the museum came perilously close to not receiving the gift at all is a little-known history that I've explored fully in the book. To summarize, the bequest had two pillars. The first pillar was conditionality with respect to institutional solidity. Over a 3-year period, the museum would have to prove both that it was financially stable and in the hands of competent management. Neither concept was defined. The criteria would be left to her brother Cornelius Bliss Jr. and her other executors. The second pillar was flexibility with respect to deaccessioning. She placed restrictions on only 3 pictures, the Daumier Laundress and 2 Cezannes, Pines and Rocks and Still Life with Apples. Should MoMA fail, these 3 would pass to the Metropolitan. All of the other 100-plus works could be traded at will. The 3-year provisional period, 1931 to 34, was a brutal one for the world at large and an obviously challenging time to be soliciting cultural philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller Jr. freely admitted that he would have preferred his money go to poverty charities. Clearly, many of the museum's target audience felt the same. Fearing that MoMA would fail, Cornelius Bliss approached the Metropolitan and entered discussions that were fairly advanced before he eventually conceded to MoMA's raising of a $600,000 endowment, a far cry from the $2 million that he had envisioned. Even that amount proved difficult to raise. At the last minute, young Nelson Rockefeller swooped in anonymously with a missing $100,000, swearing Bliss's niece to secrecy and saying, "You know, my mother is so crazy for this museum to really mean something to people and for people to love modern art as much as she does. I just feel it would mean a great deal more to her if it came from somebody out there than if she knew it came from me." Next slide. I must speed up the history time clock here. I wanted to spend most of our time today on Bliss as a living actor, and so I'm forced to shortchange the rest of the story, which takes place from the bequest in 1934 up until 1952. This slide hints at that time by showing the physical progress of the institution. Its first permanent home at 11 West 53rd Street in 1936, the Goodwin Stone Building in 1939, and the generational change in leadership that occurs when Nelson Rockefeller and John Hay Jock Whitney come to the fore. As Russell Lynes noted, it would have been difficult to find anywhere two young men so preposterously rich and at the same time so determined to justify themselves by the intelligent use of their money. Neither was a do-gooder in the pejorative sense of that overworked epithet, but each had been brought up to a sense of public responsibility. These two young men shaped the future of the institution, which was still tied up with that of the Bliss collection all through the Depression, all through World War II, and well into the post-war period. The book follows the pictures themselves on a journey through the New York Museum ecosystem, first showing how they are cherished and deployed in MoMA's early exhibitions, and then later considered surplus to requirements as art history progresses and MoMA chooses the path of remaining modern, or as modern as it could under the circumstances. There were, in fact, three significant incidents of deaccessioning of Bliss collection works that were guided by these shifts in collections policy, as well as by financial considerations. The Bliss collection deaccessioning case has both positive and negative aspects. Positive in the sense that several masterpieces were acquired that epitomize the museum to this day. Negative in the sense that not all of the transactions could be described as economically optimal or art historically sound. Next slide. The first episode occurred as early as 1937, when Degas' Jockeys on Horseback Before Distant Hills of 1884 was swapped through Jacques Seligman for Picasso's La Damsel d'Avignon, 1907, a picture believed by some at the time to be the most important painting of the 20th century. This is a complicated transaction that is detailed in the book, but let me share a couple of the parameters. The Picasso was priced to $28,000, and the Degas had been valued in Bliss's estate to $40,000. Seligman agreed to take the Degas on consignment, assuming that its eventual sale proceeds would come somewhere near its evaluation and hence above the posted price of the Picasso. Instead, after two fruitless years, Seligman was forced to sell Jockeys to an American client for $18,000. Accordingly, the transaction constituted, from MoMA's vantage point, an even trade between the Degas and the Picasso. A good deal by any measure. Next slide. The second episode occurred 4 years later, when Van Gogh's Starry Night, 1889, was acquired in exchange through Paul Rosenberg of two Cézannes and a Toulouse-Lautrec. That may seem on the face to be a very advantageous transaction, but it's worth noting that unlike La Demoiselle, the Starry Night in 1941 was not an iconic work, having been rarely seen since its acquisition in 1906 by a private collector in Rotterdam. According to a list Barr compiled in one of his later collections policy reports, the Starry Night had been offered to the market during 1936 at a price of $30,000, but was passed on by MoMA due to, quote, no funds, no trustee interest. The Rosenberg-MoMA transaction, which closed in September 1941, is recorded in the Rosenberg Stockbook as an even exchange, implying a target price for Starry Night of $35,000. That is, the sum of the values he recorded for the three Bliss collection works. Rosenberg held those three works for several years. By 1947, all had been sold at a total price of $72,000, more than double that valuation. The yield to Rosenberg, reflecting as it does the realized market value of the exchange works, is a more appropriate measure of the effective price to MoMA of the Starry Night. Accordingly, it appears that MoMA overpaid for the Van Gogh by undervaluing its own Bliss collection holdings, a mistake that it would soon repeat in its next and largest round of deaccessioning in 1944. Next slide. As the war raged on and the museum faced a combination of financial stress and management discontinuity, a plan was advanced for capital raising through a public auction at Park Burnett Galleries in May 1944. According to one historian, quote, selling pictures to raise purchase money for other works of art had never been tested on so large a scale. The collection's policy, summarized here on the slide, was essentially sell the Cezannes. In other words, the Bliss collection. The proceeds were intended to be recycled into contemporary works. The problem was that this sale could not have come at a worse time for the art market. As James Thrall Sobey later recounted, quote, the prices were low even for the dismal spring of 1944, and some fine paintings were lost to the museum forever, among them a few which should have never been sold at any price, certainly not publicly. Proceeds to the museum were a mere $64,000. The Bliss collection works sold, including 4 Cezanne paintings and 4 watercolors, a Duran, a Matisse, and 2 Seurat drawings, in almost all cases yielded less than Bliss had paid for them in the 1920s. Next slide. Our story ends with an episode that I would like to write a whole book about, an asset and financial exchange between MoMA, the Metropolitan, and the Whitney, known as the Three Museum Agreement of 1947 to 52. This episode in New York Museum history has been unevenly chronicled, and I've tried to correct the record with archival sources and draw new conclusions about its circumstances and ramifications. Shown here are the three museum presidents, Roland Redmond, Flora Whitney Miller, and Jock Whitney, entering into an arrangement that had two objectives. First, to establish clear art historical territorial boundaries between them, and second, to establish a mechanism for MoMA to feed its collection into the Metropolitan as it aged into classic art in exchange for cash that would fund its contemporary acquisitions. Next slide. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, it turns out. After a modest amount of art and cash changed hands between MoMA and the Met, including 10 important Bliss collection works such as Woman in White, Uncle Dominic, The Laundress, and key Seurat drawings that remain at the Metropolitan today, the Whitney backed out in 1948, and MoMA started looking for an off-ramp, which it found in a legal loophole in 1952. Seen through a Bliss-centric lens, the Three Museum Agreement is the final chapter in the Bliss narrative. The agreement's conception, negotiation, execution, and ultimate failure transformed MoMA Collections policy, and it exposed the futility of fixing art historical territorial boundaries between unrelated institutions. Inadvertently, it ensured a secure future for the remaining Bliss collection works, today totaling some 70, in what would become the long-imagined permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Well, Samantha, there's a lot to unpack there. Please start wherever you'd like.
So I have us in the reading room right now, and the reason why is that I have a couple slides for our Q&A section. So I thought we would start off by talking about two of the deaccessions that you discussed for two probably of the most iconic pictures at MoMA, the Les Demoiselles d'Avion. Let me change my screen there just to highlight this. And I'll start with this picture. Do you think that Lillie Bliss would have purchased this painting had she had the opportunity to do so?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, given one of the parameters for deaccessioning in American museums has got to be some sensitivity to donor intent. And the way I like to look at this, the Bliss bequest, is that clearly donor intent was, yes, indeed, there should be a metabolic aspect to the collection, and a certain churning that would permit the acquisition of modern masterpieces such as the Demoiselle. Now the point though is that we don't know how she felt about we know how she felt about Picasso generally. There's a question. There was a letter. Leonce Rosenberg wrote a letter to John Quinn in 1921, asking for advice on which American collectors to approach with Cubism. And he said, don't call Lillie Bliss. She has no interest in Cubism. Well, John Quinn uh, wasn't completely accurate, because as you can see on the left there, Green Still Life of 1914, Bliss acquired that in 1922 out of the Collecting sale. So, I mean, that is indeed a painting we would classify as a cubist work. And so that sort of gives you pause for thought. Another thing we don't show on the slide is she did buy the Pourchoises from Fontainebleau in 1921 that are believed to be the templates for three musicians. That was also in 1923. And then of course she bought A Woman in White in 1923. So I would say is a big question mark. She recognizes Picasso to be, a great force in modern art, perhaps the greatest at the year of her death. But her particular interest in Cubism pretty much is limited. So we have no answer to that question. But I think it's fair to say that she would have appreciated if everybody on the board of MoMA was agreeing that this was the most important picture of the 20th century, which they were very, very, very satisfied with that notion, that I think that we could agree that Lillie Bliss would have you know concurred.
Well, aesthetically, they certainly look nice together.
They they did.
So now on to this is more of a discovery that you and I kind of made talking together. And this is, I think, really important why we speak to our colleagues who are in different institutions. We don't always think of the Frick as a museum that would have been offered these modern pictures at the time. And this is not new to people at the Frick, because my colleague Inga Reese presented on a presentation called Frick After Frick, which I can stick into the chat later because it is available on the Frick website for you to watch if you're interested in learning what came up to the Frick collection after Frick. And in this slide, we see that the Starry Night, along with this Degas, two sisters, and I have the LACMA, it's saying where the picture is today, and the title, so you can see that on the screen. But this was offered to the Frick. It was a special exhibition in March of 1941, and the painting was valued, Starry Night, I'm referring to specifically at that time, for $50,000. So that's it makes it look like the MoMA got a deal. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I just think it's interesting that, as you said, I mean, our discovery in the sense that that this picture could have been at the Frick if they had a different, because I think if we looked, I think what we found in the dates is that it may well have been over at the Frick. Did you say it was there for like a week, right, in the boardroom? Yeah. It may well have been over there before it was over at MoMA. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing to speculate on.
And interestingly so, I'm going to switch to the next slide. One of the founding trustees of the Frick collection was John D. Rockefeller, Abby Rockefeller, and founding member of MoMA's husband. And I'm just showing you a couple of pictures, but one picture and two sculptures that he left to the Frick. And I'll go back to the other slide. I think about that museum agreement that you talk about, and to see like everybody, there was so much overlapping, like who's forming the museums and then having deference for each other. Do you want to talk a little bit more about
Oh, yes. I think it's one of the more interesting things that I'm not going to suggest that's my discovery, but in my trolling through so much of the institutional materials, I found it just really eye-opening that from the very beginning, I mean, there's correspondence between the MoMA organizing committee in the summer 1929 and Abby Rockfell at one point, sends out to everybody and says, "Well, has anyone told the Metropolitan what we're doing?" Almost as though they knew the imprimatur of the senior institution, or they, again, their concept from the very beginning was there was going to be um, some sort of collaborative arrangement might be necessary, because they weren't, I think they were not completely confident that a museum dedicated to modern art was going to be able to support itself, at that juncture. Maybe a sense that this kind of feeder idea, this American Luxembourg idea, might be the most appropriate way to do it. And it's just very interesting given what we all now know about what happened subsequent these were the kind of thoughts that people were having at the time. But the other thing I said about the boards, yeah, it is like an interlocking directorate. I mean, these people, they're 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 all on the boards, And one of the things that's interesting about during the period from 31 to 34, when MoMA's trying to prove that it can meet the Bliss conditions, um, Cornelius Bliss joins the Met Board at that time. Stephen Clark's on the Met Board at that time, as is Professor Sachs. So there is quite a bit of overlap, and so it wasn't as though, so as Cornelius Bliss became more kind of part of the Met family, I think he was starting to say that this would be a better place for my sister's collection. But then at the end, of course, he was persuaded that it was really what she wanted to do. And he did say that as he was handing it over. He said, I know I've kind of backed down on my financial conditions, but I know this is what she had done with her life. And I think that I have to respect that. So he's really quite a hero in this story. There are many heroes in this story, but he's one that I'm especially interested in.
I was interested to know, what was said about the Starry Night on the Frick side, and despite the director at the time being he seemed to really love the picture, we didn't take it. And I wonder, like, what kind of conversations were going behind the scenes. I mean, we'll never know that, right?
We'll never know. We'll never know.
Okay, so moving on beyond that, I will start the questioning with thinking about your research methodologies. And so I am the digital art history lead at the Frick. And I remember when I first asked you, did you use any digital art history tools in your research? You said no. But then as we discussed it a little bit more, and I think this is kind of something I wanted to point out too to scholars, is that you can use these tools, and you are doing digital art history. They're helping you analyze the materials, but you don't necessarily have to have the visualizations or a big project to call it that use of methodology. So,
well, sometimes you're using digital art history and you don't even know you're using it. I mean, it's interesting. As Samantha and I discussed, when I was at this brief period, I was at the Frick, and I was just starting to reconstruct the collection. And so I did, in fact, put the images into areas because I was trying to, have a better sense of the scale and to think about, again, the timeline. And I had to keep referring, I had to get my eye acquainted to the sequence of Bliss's acquisitions, because again, back to this concept, is it European art, is it American art? And I was thinking from the very beginning that no, it's not, it's not that. She's looking at things. She's got a very, her taste has a real aesthetic through line that you can detect, but you have to kind of look at all the pictures, and it helps to see them in the sequence in which they were acquired to do that. So that's the kind of thing that I was helped by a digital art history tool.
And can you tell me about any challenges that you have doing research for Bliss herself?
Yeah, interestingly, she had her personal correspondence burned by her family at her death, which is obviously regrettable for historians. So I had to do a lot of work. I'm not sure I set out with the idea that I was going to do all this work on the New York art market of the 1920s. But as this project evolved, that was what had to be done to kind of triangulate around the fact that there were no Bliss papers. So that with that, I embarked on, this task of what was so interesting about her collecting, as I pointed out. I mean, she dealt with like 20 different dealers. It's not as though she was just getting an offer from, a single dominant dealer and accepting it or rejecting it. I mean, she was actually shopping around from dealer to dealer. She's building her collection. And all those dealers have papers, well, to one degree or another. So that sets you down another route, which is really looking at the market. And as I sort of decided in the beginning, that what she didn't buy is as important as what she did buy. So to reconstruct what's happening in the market, you have to really look at each of these dealers, and you have to say, okay, what shows did they have in 1926? What artists did they have in stock? You just have to imagine that she's in the gallery, that she says, I'm going to take that, Surratt drawing as opposed to something else. So to do that, some of these dealers, they're all their records are digitized. Beth is an example, but a lot of them are not. Some of them exist at the Archives of American Art, and then many of them exist in the Frick Art Reference Library. And they are in, some of these things are pamphlets. They're not what we would call today exhibition catalogs. And they're 2 pages and a list of paintings. And the Frick has a collection of these, what I think now we consider quite ephemeral documents. But they made it possible for me to say, oh, okay, the year that Lillie Bliss bought this work from this dealer, she could have also bought these things. And so that was the key to my really being able to understand. It's not the most scientific methodology, but it's as close as you can get when you're looking at an art market. And so yeah, so thank you forever to the Frick for that opportunity.
Yeah, those are our pamphlet. We call them pamphlet files. That's what we affectionately refer to them as. They're one area in the library, but they're very helpful for this kind of thing, like finding these where they didn't have exhibition catalogs. So as I read your book, with the understanding that Abby Rockefeller and Lillie P. Bliss met in DC, which is a huge discovery and a correction of history. Thank you. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that now. But I couldn't help but think of their shared dealers as I read through your book. And I think of Valentina as being a very pivotal person, in the sense that, well, he was educating Abby, and that Lillie had purchased from him. And I was wondering, would you think there's any opportunity for exhibitions or things with Valentina where they may have crossed paths, or will we just not know?
Well, actually, she actually didn't. It's Valentine Dudensing that
All right.
yeah. No, it's funny. It's like, it's like, yeah. No, Valentina was like an advisor to Abby, but he was not an advisor to Bliss.
Okay.
And Abby probably certainly bought things from Valentine Dudensing and Pierre Matisse. They are a very interesting duo, and they do business together as the Valentine Gallery. Um, well, we're all going to learn about this because my friend Julia May Bodwin is coming out. The next book in the Bloomsbury series is a book about the Dudensing Gallery that's coming out in the winter this year. So I'm really looking forward to that because I only know a fragment of that story, and the fragment I know is the correspondence between Pierre and and Valentine as they're doing business together in New York, and that's a very interesting period. And one of the things that I did find that makes me a little sad is that I looked at their accounts. Their papers are all in the Morgan Library. And I looked at their accounts, and there's a big accounts receivable from Lillie Bliss the year that they went out of business. And it's a large sum. And I've always felt a little bit like she might have been one of the reasons why they didn't succeed. But we'll leave that there. For the time being. But Abby, interestingly, was very involved with Edith Halpert. And that's a great story that's been told in a couple of the Edith Halpert, some of the research on her. Lillie never, I don't think she ever went below 14th Street. She never went downtown, so in some ways, Abby was kind of having maybe perhaps a more adventurous time of it with the dealers. Then anyway, I'm sorry. And you asked about the politicians, the fathers.
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting thing that both of these women are the daughters of very important political figures, and I think that their sort of their way of being in the world, their knowing how to organize things, how to exert power, how to chair meetings, whatever. I think that comes from their fathers, and I think that's a really important part of the story that doesn't get, a lot of times when people have misrepresented Lillie Bliss as being somehow the creature of Arthur Davies, and I think that's really not the story, not the story at all. But the idea that this is something that Abby and Lillie had in common, and their fathers were, of course, friends. So there you go.
Well, the book is like super packed. I think I'm gonna have to read it a second time. Clearly, I got the Valentine and Valentiner mixed up in the notes. Yeah, so it's great. And I actually also wanted to say there's some questions. I'm gonna go to Q&A shortly with the audience. But one of the things that you did differently with your dissertation, which I think is amazing, and I think this might give us a point where you and I can collaborate on a project, was that you kept a spreadsheet of everything that Bliss purchased, and you shared that with me before before today. And I have been playing with it a little bit, visualizing information. I think one of the questions does tie into in the Q&A to this, in the sense that I just looked at like the amount, not the amount of money she spent on pictures over her collecting period, and there were two key kind of highlights, and you actually do address this in your book, but it was just fun to see the data is also showing that, is that in 1913 purchases, I think there's like 26 things that she buys, and then again in 1923. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. She buys a lot at the armory show. That, as I said, that's kind of what kickstarts her collecting career. But she also buys a few things in advance of the Armory show and then lends them to the show, again, anonymously. This is one of the parts of piecing the story together and kind of looking for a ghost. Um, and this is not to take anything away from the very good Armory show scholarship that was done by Milton Brown and others in the 1960s and 70s. But there are some gaps in the way that was presented, and Bliss doesn't come up as a major character in the Armory show story the way it's been told so far. And I think it's this anonymity question, and how I get to the thing about the money is that I know from what I've been able to learn about Arthur Davies that he certainly could not have contributed that amount of money in that year. I don't know if people know his personal story, but it's quite, he was a bigamist. His second family, yeah, there was a child was born in that year. He was really hard up for cash, and William Macbeth had a special exhibition for him at which Bliss came in and bought, like, all the pictures, and then I think she gave him some money on the side as well for that, for the purpose of the Armory show. So that's kind of how I just assume at this point, which is probably a bad thing for a historian to do, but I'm going to make the leap and say that Arthur Davis money was Lillie Bliss money. And if you do that, then you kind of come to the conclusion. So, and then she buys a lot, like I said, at the Armory show. She's the third largest buyer after John Quinn and Arthur Jerome Eddy. And that also doesn't get highlighted enough, but it's important.
And then what triggered the 1923 purchases? Because there's about 30 some pictures.
In 23, that's a big year. That's a big year for her. A lot happens. One of the things that I talk about in the book is there's the first institutionally consecrated exhibitions of modern art in America take place in 1920 and 21. They start at the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts. Then there's three in New York. There's Kalekian, as he puts his collection up for sale and first it's shown at the Brooklyn Museum. Then the Museum of French Art in Manhattan has a show. And then the big show is the Metropolitan Museum. And what happens is that Lillie is involved in all of those shows, either lending her pictures or, and to the point of partially, co-organizing, I would say, the show at the Met. And in the subsequent year, she buys something like, oh, I don't know. She ends up owning like 18 of the pictures that were shown across the three shows. So that's part of what's happening in 1923. And then there's, well, again, that's kind of where all the sales start to bulk up in there. Then there's for those of you who are real aficionados of this period, you might know about the Hogendijk dispersal, which occurs in Amsterdam. That's that's a big collection of post-impressionist painting, a lot of Cezannes. And that's a situation where Lillie Bliss buys like three Cezannes out of that. Albert Barnes buys like 17 out of that. So that's kind of another thing that's happening right around then. This period, 21, 22, 23, 24, and then so you've got the Kalekian sale, then you've got Hogendijk, then you've got the Quinn dispersal, because John Quinn dies in 24, and then his paintings, his whole collection is dispersed in 25, 26. So these are all the international art market events that shape supply. And what I find very interesting about looking at these markets is that, demand is developing, obviously. Everyone likes to attribute the demand explosion post Armory show, but it's not all on the demand side. A lot of this is on the supply side. You have to kind of think about how those two things, like in any market, you have to think about how those things interact. And I think what's interesting about Lillie Bliss is she's such a major collector in at this moment. So in her collecting practice, you can find all these things, all these things pop up that you say, oh, well, I bet that affected other people as well. And that affected prices and that affected, all sorts of things that happened. So I find her to be she's a good character to look at to understand, a bigger world, I think. And I think that's a big part of why she's important historically.
And I guess I'm gonna kind of change the first question a little bit because we know that she was interested in purchasing at the Armory show. But any like glimmer of anything that she may have been interested in Duchamp's nude descending the staircase?
No, 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 no. She wouldn't have liked that. She would have had no interest in that.
Okay.
She's
And
like, no, no, no. This is funny. I mean, I think this is what John Quinn was saying to Leonce Rosenberg. Like, I mean, it's so funny because so much of the focus in Armour show myth is on that one picture, and I mean, even Duchamp got sick of talking about nude descending at some point. So it is interesting to think about, but that is not something that I think John Quinn took a look at it, but I no, Louis did not.
And then I have a question from Janet Brooks. She was also one of our research fellows at the library. And she asks, when did Bliss begin buying from bourgeois and what did she purchase?
Oh, the Gauguin, Hina Tafatu came from bourgeois. I think that's a little bit of a complicated thing because it goes. I might have to refer to my memory. Well, I might lose my memory here, but there's a thing about, is that a Desires picture or is that a bourgeois picture? Bourgeois is the dealer record on that sale, but Desires had it. He lent it. Desires, by the way, had the first solo exhibition of Gauguin in America. I mean, all the dealers I show on that slide, I could give you, each one of them is responsible for being the showcase for these artists coming into the American market, which is a very interesting fact that I didn't know until I started doing this research. So he had the picture, he showed it. He's the lender of record in the Met 21 exhibition, but Bourgeois is the dealer of sales. So I don't know the answer to that. She never bought anything else from him, but he's down there as that. And that's a really important picture. And it was expensive, and it was a major acquisition. And it was interesting because MoMA showed it, had it on has been exhibiting it, and it's a great thing to see. Um, another we were talking about Green Still Life before, which is another great picture to see, and MoMA had it, and they put it up in the Bliss exhibition.
And
So,
speaking of price, someone was asking about your book, if there was a discount. So I'm going to, sorry, not discreetly, put the code into the chat so people can get 20% off for coming today. It's in there for you. There wasn't a different code for UK versus USA, correct?
no, it seemed to be just one code.
Okay, that's in there for anybody who would like to purchase the book. And I suggest that you do. I'll be reading it again myself. And then I have a question from Carol Creel. Irene, what sense do you get of the person, Lillie Bliss, as you studied her art collection? Do you have any sense of what she was like personality wise?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've been sort of I'm grappling with that a little bit throughout the whole time I've been studying her, because at first she was, it's like I said, it's like looking for a ghost in a way, and there's a lot of talk about how she'd led this very repressed personal life, and that she was very, she was kind of, you get this sense, people say, not taking her seriously, or that she was very retiring and all that. And then the more that I'm sorry, somebody says they're losing audio. Is that?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Hang on there.
So so then you hear those stories, and then you say, well, I don't know that can be true. I think she was forced into a situation where she did have to take care of her mother. But when the mother died in 1923, I mean, I she sold the family home. She bought off the plan that magnificent apartment and had it designed to her specification. The other thing is she had all these friends in the performing arts. She was, the New Yorkers on this call know certainly know Eleanor Belmont. That was one of her good friends. She was also involved. I didn't mention this before, but she was a little bit involved in the foundation of Juilliard. So as a pianist, she had insight into, the musical and performing arts world. And, I just have the impression that once she kind of came into her own, whether it was financially or psychologically, that's a bad word to use as an art historian, but you can't help it. And I think she knew what she wanted to do. And at some point in midpoint of her career, she decides that what she's going to do is build this art historically robust collection bond art. And I think it just clicks in her head that she's going to institutionalize it. Now, she doesn't know she's going to found a museum yet, but I think she thinks that she's going to put it somewhere and that it's going to stand as a whole and it's going to make a statement. It's going to help people understand something. Now, that to me is an ambition that is not the ambition of a shy retiring person. That is somebody who you know, has a calling in life that she then executes on. And in a male dominated world, I think we can all agree. But, you know, so yes, that is the sense that I've that's the image that I take with me from this project.
And I guess it's something that you and I spoke about leading up to today too, is like operating in a man's world, but you're finding her in the men's archives too, because women's archives weren't preserved to the same extent as men have been. It would be interesting if we had archive collections for everybody, including Lillie P. Bliss herself.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I have a next question. So you mentioned that you were seeing her purchases chronologically and that allowed you to understand her aesthetic. How would you describe or characterize that aesthetic?
Well, her I would say look at Davies. Well, look at Cezanne and Davies. Those are the two pillars of the collection, right? And you would say, well, these artists don't have anything to do with each other, obviously. I mean that your first impulse. But sometimes Davies sort of this kind of proto-symbolist style that he kind of worked with over time. But then he goes into a little bit of a cubist phase himself right after the Armory Show. I think he's influenced by Cezanne. Everyone's influenced by Cezanne. So she has a run among her American artists are artists influenced by Cezanne. She's got Cezanne. She's got, you see, so you start to tease out some things, but I guess maybe the better way to answer that, I'm kind of fumbling for an answer, but maybe a better way to answer that is you could tell the things that she wouldn't like, you know. Um, and then it was great seeing the MoMA exhibition, to really see some of these things up on the wall, to see the Davies next to the Cezannes, which that's the way she hung them. I mean, look at the picture of her apartment, which is another thing I find really interesting, to see, because today you'd be like, well, we're not even going to hang up the Davies, but you start to say, well, why? It really he's a more interesting artist, I think, than people give him credit now. And the other thing is the Prendergast, very important to the story. But Maurice Prendergast was one of the most important sort of advocates for Cezanne in America. He was, kind of, he wrote a little about it. He spent a lot of time, you know, her American artists are all European influenced, particularly Cezanne influenced. I guess that's where I would go with that. And that, who knew that? I didn't know that until I started looking at the background of all the American artists in this piece.
So we are running out of time, Irene. We've got like 1 minute left. There's a few questions in the Q&A. One, I don't know if you know anything about whatever happened to the Museum of French Art. That's a question.
Oh, I don't, and I wish somebody would write a book about that.
Yeah, there you go. There's a new research topic if you want to take that. And then I have from Jean Brosiana Asani, sorry, excuse me for pronouncing your name incorrectly. She says, was the dealer bourgeois Stefan Bourgeois, the husband? Yes, okay. I think that's the end of that question. And then somebody wanted to know when she morphed from Lizzie to Lillie Bliss.
Oh, that's a good final question. I love this. This goes back to personality too. Okay, so at birth and death, her name is Lizzie Plummer Bliss, not Elizabeth. Lizzie Plummer Bliss. From when she was a child throughout her entire life, she said to people, "My name is Lillie," and people called her Lillie. When she died, there was some confusion, and I saw this in Memo Correspondence when they're trying to put together the exhibition catalog for the memorial. And there was a little bit of, what are we going to call it? Are we going to call it the Lizzie Bliss collection or the Lillie Bliss collection? Cornelius Bliss steps in and says, I'm going to go to court and have my sister's name changed legally to Lillie so that nobody will ever make that mistake again. So isn't that great?
That's great. That's a great, and that is a great note to end on. So I just want to say thank you so much for sharing this with you today. And please, everybody, read the book. Talk to your friends and colleagues. I'm sure there's other discoveries to be made. And again, thank you so much. One shameless thing I want to say is that in the fall, the Frick Art Research Library, we're going to have a series of provenance research workshops in October. So stay tuned for that. And again, thank you so much, Irene.
Thank you, Samantha. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Frick.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.